Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot across the cool, mossy flagstones of Angkor Wat. It's just before sunrise, and the temple's silhouette jagged, massive. A stone crown piercing a silver sky rises like the spine of some ancient god. The air is still and heavy, thick with the smell of damp stone, jungle sap, and incense ash. Bats flutter somewhere in the vaults above you. Beneath your feet, the floor still remembers centuries of bare sawless queens, monks, dancers, spies, lovers, ghosts. You tilt your head, and for a breathless moment, you swear the walls are humming. That's when you notice it. Not just one wall. All of them, carved in delicate, obsessive detail. Rows and rows of impossibly graceful dancers, apsaras there. Called each with breasts too round to be ornamental, hips too inviting to be metaphorical. You lean in closer, and suddenly they're not just art. They're watching, waiting. Some smiling slyly, some mid-spin, some with hands suspiciously placed, mid-suggestive gesture. They were never just decoration. And this was never just a temple. This is a theater of the flesh. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Cambodia wants to know. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press further into the shadows, heart thumping like a guilty schoolboy in detention. The stone corridors wind like veins through the temple's body, leading you past doorways where the paint is gone but the carvings remain. And they tell stories, not of war, not of harvest, but of union, intimacy. You run your fingers over a carving that shows what could only be called a divine entanglement. 3 figures, 1 deity, and several limbs doing, well, things we're not going to describe here. Not because it's inappropriate, but because the temple's making you blush for real. And you're not even sure why. Because here's the twist. This isn't just erotica on a sacred wall. This is the blueprint of Khmer cosmology, politics, and power. Sex was not scandal, it was sacrament. It was the sacred duty of kings to perform pleasure, to please the gods with flesh as well as prayers. And when the gods were satisfied, the rains came. The rice grew. The kingdom thrived. You step outside for a moment, needing air. A wide stone courtyard opens before you. The sun has begun to rise, casting everything in gold. You see it now. The entire layout of Angkor Wat is a mandala, a diagram of the universe itself. And right in the center, the inner sanctum, sits the lingam. A carved stone phallus, not hidden, not metaphorical, not blasphemous, but worshipped, bathed daily in sacred milk and honey. Not because of what it represents, but because of what it is: life, creation, power. You sit beside it, cross-legged, trying to picture the rituals. The soft chants in Pali or Sanskrit, the dancers weaving like water around a priest-king. The smell of jasmine, sweat, and sandalwood. And in the middle of it all, a moment that feels less like performance and more like invocation. As if sex itself was a way to summon divine energy to align the human body with cosmic rhythms. But that's just the surface. You want the full story. You want the uncomfortable questions. Why were some women raised to serve temples, offered to gods they could never refuse? Why were phallic and vaginal symbols carved so casually alongside images of warfare and harvest? Why did French colonialists in the 1800s try so hard to erase these truths? To repaint Angkor as a chaste monument to high civilization and architectural genius, while quietly burning the erotic scrolls they couldn't translate. You rise and walk deeper into the temple, passing under a lintel that bears a scene of Shiva and Parvati in union. Their eyes are half closed, their limbs form a sacred knot. Around them, animals gaze on, not shocked, but serene. Because this isn't pornography. It's metaphysics. This isn't debauchery. It's theology. It's the idea that creation itself is born of tension and release, of duality and union, of pleasure as portal. Historians still argue whether these rituals were widespread state religion or the privilege of royal cults. Some insist they were symbolic, pure allegory. Others claim they were literal, sacred rites enacted in private by priestesses, kings, and the divine incarnate. There's no way to know for sure, but the evidence whispers louder than official narratives. Take for instance the tale of King Jayavarman, the seventh, notorious for his building projects and spiritual zeal, but also whispered about for his nightly rituals said to involve offerings of beauty, incense, and female form. One story goes that he maintained not one queen, but multiple divine wives, each assigned a specific planetary energy. Each night he rotated between them, balancing cosmic forces through physical union. Duty, not indulgence. Harmony, not Harun. And then there's the stranger, softer tale of a courtesan raised from childhood in the temple grounds, taught not only the arts of dance and seduction, but philosophy, poetry, and ritual. Her name is lost to history, but she lived to be 80. Rumor has it, kings sought her out not for her body, but for her wisdom. She was said to have known how to summon rain with her breath, how to still a fever with her touch, and how to speak the language of gods when kissed. You catch your breath. Because for a culture that modern tourism sells with elephant pants and spiritual detox packages, ancient Cambodia hides a much deeper truth. These temples were not static relics. They were alive, pulsing with desire, not in the carnal sense, but in the metaphysical one. Desire as cosmic engine, pleasure as pact with the divine, and sex. Well, sex was never just sex. It was sacred duty. And you're only just getting started. You pause under a carved archway, your shadow tangled with centuries of history. The stone around you glows a gentle amber as the sun rises higher, illuminating figures that once moved not just in legend, but in flesh. And now, here comes the twist that scrapes the modern brain. These weren't just sacred spaces for quiet prayers and incense wafting upward. These temples were built as homes for gods who expected something far more intimate than worship. They wanted pleasure. You glance up at a bas-relief of Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent, and it's easy to miss the detail until you're inches away. His consort Lakshmi isn't just seated near him in demure adoration, she's touching him. Softly, sensually, reverently. And it hits you, this wasn't passive admiration. It was foreplay, immortalized in stone. Because in the Khmer conception of the cosmos, gods were active participants in the cycles of creation. And creation begins not with a bang, but with a sigh, a moan, a deep inhale just before two bodies become one. Here, in the sanctuary of 1,000 carved bodies, you begin to understand. The gods were not sexless clouds of light floating above the messiness of life. No, they mirrored human passion. Or perhaps it was the other way around. In Khmer Hinduism, early Mahayana Buddhism, the sacred could only be accessed through wholeness. And wholeness demanded union, the merging of masculine and feminine, Shiva and Shakti, spirit and sensation. So the gods didn't just bless union, they required it. Sex wasn't a distraction from the divine. It was the doorway. You walk slowly, eyes tracing scenes that unfold like mythological fan fiction. Vishnu with multiple arms, each embracing a different goddess. Shiva dancing wild, surrounded by apsaras whose legs defy bone logic. And yes, scenes of women with other women, gods with hermaphrodites, and one very confusing relief involving a horse-headed man that modern scholars still argue about over espressos and white wine. The point isn't who's doing what to whom. The point is that doing was the thing itself, not as sin, not as shame, but as sacred reenactment of cosmic play. There's something achingly human in that. You think of the priests who tended these temples, not stiff-robed ascetics, but mystics who believed that divine ecstasy came through, merging not just spirit and thought, but skin and breath. One fringe record tells of an annual ritual where the high priestess would choose a man, often a prince, and after days of fasting and prayer, they would enter the inner sanctum. There, to the rhythm of bells and drum, they would perform the sacred act, not behind closed doors, but within sight of a select audience of initiates. Not voyeurism, not scandal, but transmission. Their bodies as scripture, their moans as mantras. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or symbolic legend, but the consistency across sources is unsettlingly precise. And then there's the story of a Khmer queen, possibly Indra Devi, scholar and consort to Jayavarman VII, was said to have hosted nightly salons in the temple, poetry readings, philosophical debates, and at midnight, ritual unions. One poem describes her as wearing only language and stars, seated atop a stone cushion warmed by rose oil. Her body was not considered hers alone. It was a bridge between realms. Her pleasure was political, her climax a contract between earth and sky. You start to feel the echo of something strange and ache, not sexual, but spiritual. Like you've been looking at the wrong blueprint for too long. In your world, sex is a commodity, a performance, a taboo. But here, it was liturgy. The line between the sacred and the sensual didn't just blur, it dissolved. To touch was to believe. To unite was to heal. To please was to serve the gods. A gust of wind carries the scent of lotus and wood smoke. You glance at another carving, smaller, almost hidden in a corner column. Two figures, one clearly divine, the other visibly human. They are close, forehead to forehead, eyes closed. Their hands touch lightly, almost shyly. And in that stillness you sense the pulse of something deeper. Maybe it wasn't always about ecstasy. Maybe sometimes the sacred was found in stillness, in presence, in breath shared between mortal and immortal. A quiet contract made not in thunder, but in whisper. And right there, you remember a story from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, about a temple dancer who fell in love with a visiting philosopher. He believed sex distracted from enlightenment. She believed sex was enlightenment. For months, they debated in the moonlight, she with jasmine in her hair, he with books in his lap. One night, she kissed him mid-argument, and he didn't stop her. They made love under the Bodhi tree. Years later, he would write, "She showed me that the body is not the prison of the soul, but its first temple." You sigh, because that's what this place is, a first temple, a sacred skin of stone. And the gods who lived here? They wanted worship, yes, but not just on your knees with hands folded. They wanted you to feel, to open, to lose yourself not in fear, but in fullness. And isn't that terrifying? Because it demands everything. Not just belief, but surrender. Not just ritual, but vulnerability. You think about modern temples' glass towers and sterile pews. The way intimacy has been scrubbed from religion. And here, in this jungle-wrapped ruin, you find the opposite. A sacredness soaked in skin, pulse, and desire. You're not the first to feel this dissonance. When French explorers first documented Angkor in the 19th century, they were scandalized. Their journals are full of euphemisms and repressed horror. One wrote that the carvings lacked decorum suitable for a house of God. Another compared the apsaras to indecent nymphs, ignoring the fact that they were, quite literally, angels in this culture. These colonial minds could not fathom a faith that made space for arousal. So they covered the nudes in guidebooks, cropped the photos, and labeled the erotic art as ornamental deviation. But the locals? They just laughed. One elder reportedly told an anthropologist, "How can you pray without joy in the body? That's like eating soup without salt." You smile, imagining that salty soup analogy framed in a stained glass window. Somewhere in suburban Paris, you walk on, the sun now fully risen, burning away the morning mist. The temple shimmers, as if waking up with you. You wonder if this was always the point, to wake up not just to history, but to yourself. To question what you were taught about sacredness, purity, even purpose. And to remember that maybe, just maybe, your body isn't a distraction from the divine, but its most ancient map. You press forward, fingers grazing the cool sandstone wall, each carved groove like a breadcrumb trail left by ghosts who never really left. And just when you think you've grown used to the sensual carvings, the rows of full-bodied dancers and smirking deities, something different catches your eye, a line of figures who float, almost like they're underwater, arms bent in that timeless hand-flower gesture. Their hips don't just sway, they seduce. Their eyes don't just look, they know. These are the apsaras, and you've seen them in every Angkor postcard, coffee mug, and travel brochure. But tonight, they stop being decoration. Tonight, you see them for what they really are. Divine couriers of pleasure, messengers between worlds, and yes, Khmer sex icons wrapped in heavenly choreography. These weren't just aesthetic flourishes. They were the beating heart of temple ritual, immortalized mid-dance, not because they were beautiful, but because they were powerful. It wasn't about titillation, it was about access. In the Khmer cosmology, apsaras weren't passive muses fluttering around like sparkly butterflies. They were active agents of spiritual ecstasy. To witness an apsara dance was to witness the veil between this world and the next lifting for just a moment. And if you were lucky, or pure, or chosen, you might even touch it. Imagine being a royal guest at an evening ceremony in the 12th century. The courtyard lit by hundreds of ghee lamps, the air humming with chanting monks, and then they enter the apsaras. Barefoot, veiled in silk so sheer it moved like breath itself. Their movements precise, mathematical, slow. Every turn of the wrist encoded with myth, every glance a story. You wouldn't be allowed to speak, only to feel. Because their performance wasn't entertainment, it was invocation. One account, buried in a French missionary's confused journal, describes how certain apsaras were not dancers at all, but temple mediums. Chosen young, trained fiercely, and kept within temple grounds until their bodies moved not by choice, but by divine possession. During certain festivals, they would dance alone before the shrine, eyes rolled back, fingers twitching in trance, as priests interpreted their gestures as answers from the gods. And afterward, this part was whispered. They would be laid upon perfumed mats in the inner chamber, where their trance might deepen into physical union. Not with mortal men, but with spirit itself. That's how the Khmer saw it. The union was symbolic and literal. Flesh and ghost merging for just a moment to sanctify the space. Historians still argue whether these trance unions were real, metaphorical, or something in between. But if you're honest, does it matter? The body believed it. The temple believed it. And belief, in sacred space, is often indistinguishable from fact. Now here's where it gets spicier. The apsaras weren't just spiritual figures. They were also state property. That's right, an actual administrative category in temple records. One preserved stone inscription from the reign of Suryavarman. The second lists over 2,000 apsaras as part of Angkor Wat's personnel, alongside cooks, cleaners, gardeners, and priests. But unlike the gardeners, the apsaras received perfumes, jewelry, and the occasional elephant. They were ambassadors of divine pleasure, cultural capital in human form. And they were expensive. One royal ledger records a full month's income spent on the hair ornaments of just 3 senior apsaras. Not exactly minimalist living. You wonder what their lives were like, day to day. Were they isolated, worshipped, trained until their joints ached and their backs stiffened from holding impossible poses for hours? Probably all of the above. And what happened when they aged out of their roles? That, of course, is missing from the records. The carvings never wrinkle. The stone always seduces. But maybe, somewhere in the outer rings of the temple, old apsaras walked in the mornings, remembering their nights under the stars and the weight of sacred eyes watching their every sway. And maybe, just maybe, they missed it. One fringe anthropological theory even suggests that apsara rituals were early forms of psychosomatic healing, that their movements activated emotional release, spiritual catharsis, even altered states. In modern language, sacred dance therapy, 12th century style. Imagine the next time someone recommends yoga for stress relief. You raise an eyebrow and say, "Actually, I prefer Khmer trance seduction." But the mystery deepens with a lesser-known detail. Many apsaras were tattooed. Not visibly, but along the inner arms, thighs, and lower back. Glyphs, symbols, prayers in Pali or Sanskrit, inked with a mixture of herbs, ash, and fish bile. It was believed these tattoos turned the dancer's body into a magical tool, protection against possession, amplification of energy, and in some cases, sexual enhancement. One record claims a senior apsara bore a tattoo that read, loosely translated, "I carry joy into the heart of gods." And if that's not a power move, what is? You wonder though, did they always want this role? Were all chosen willing? The darker question hangs unspoken. Some historians suggest many apsaras were taken young from nearby villages, selected for beauty, trained for obedience. A sacred cage is still a cage. But others push back, arguing these women held rare power. In an empire dominated by men, they lived in temples, not kitchens. They spoke with priests, not farmhands. Their bodies were honored, not hidden. And in some stories, it's the apsara who teaches the prince, not the other way around. You find yourself remembering one story from Sex with Kings, though it's about Europe, not Angkor. A Venetian courtesan named Veronica Franco once wrote a letter to a cardinal saying, "If you fear my body, then you fear your God." Replace the city, the cardinal, the language, and you'd have something an apsara might whisper before a ritual. If you fear my body, then you fear your God. And maybe that's the whole secret. The apsaras weren't just dancers. They were reminders of pleasure, of danger, of power, of what we lose when we split body from soul, sensuality from spirit. You look up once more. The wall dances back. Each apsara frozen in that impossible moment, mid-spin, mid-glance, mid-secret. And somewhere in your bones, you feel it. Not arousal, not shame, but recognition. That these women knew something most of us forget. That to move beautifully is to pray. That to be touched is to be changed. That sex, when sacred, doesn't just pass through you, it rewrites you. And you're only on your third step into this temple of flesh and fire. The apsaras smile. You move on. You duck into a narrower passage now, the stone darker, smoother from the centuries of fingertips brushing reverently or nervously against its walls. The air shifts, cooler, heavier, like it's holding its breath. You exhale slowly, then freeze. Because ahead of you, past a collapsed doorway, is a room not marked on any tourist map. No tour guide would lead you here. But the carvings whisper, and curiosity is a louder god than fear. You step inside, and what you see hits like a thunderclap wrapped in silk. A private chamber, carved top to bottom with scenes that do not whisper, they moan. Not vulgar, not crude elegant, tangled, unapologetically alive. Lovers in every position the human body allows, and a few it maybe doesn't. You see limbs intertwined like vines, faces melting into each other, deities mid-climax with eyes wide open, staring not in pleasure but in revelation. And at the center, a throne, low, wide, deliberately shaped. This wasn't just an artist's fever dream. This was ritual. You sit for a moment, stunned. The idea hits you like temple bells in your chest. This was the king's chamber, his ritual site. Not for sleep, not even for politics, but for sex. Sacred, calculated, state-endorsed sex. Because in the Khmer Empire, love wasn't personal. It was public service. The king wasn't just a ruler. He was a conductor of cosmic balance, and his climax? That was the final note of the national symphony. Let that sink in. Somewhere in this very room, a king once enacted divine copulation, under the watchful eyes of gods carved above him. Not in secret, not with shame, but with ritual purpose to unite heaven and earth through his own body. And now, it's your turn to watch. You imagine at midnight, torches flickering, incense thick as fog, drums pounding slowly. The king enters, wearing only gold and jasmine oil. The priestess waits, her body painted in sacred symbols. Their movements aren't rushed. Every touch is preordained. Every motion part of a script written in stars. And as they join, the temple itself seems to breathe with them. The priests chant. The crowd holds still. Somewhere in the inner shrine, a lingam is anointed. And just as the king reaches the climax of both act and ritual, a gong sounds. The kingdom is once again aligned with the cosmos. Rain will come, crops will rise, enemies will falter. And the gods, pleased. You shift in your seat, torn between awe and unease. There's something both glorious and unsettling here. A kingdom run not by military might or bureaucratic decree, but by the raw, honest surrender of bodies in union. Sex as civic responsibility, and kingship as performance art with a metaphysical twist. One legend tells of a king who failed to complete the ritual. Not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive nights. By the 4th day, a drought began. By the 10th, a rebellion. It said he fled the capital in shame, and the river refused to flow again until a new, younger king took the throne and the priestess. You may laugh, but think about it. In a world where gods didn't live in heaven but through you, failure to pleasure the divine wasn't just embarrassing, it was cosmic. Malpractice. Historians still argue whether these rituals were ceremonial metaphors or actual, physical acts. But old temple records written in stone no less detail oil inventories, incense schedules, and goddess attendants assigned by rank and lunar calendar. Not exactly subtle. And this brings us to the oddest twist of all. The people approved. These weren't hidden rites. Villagers would gather for processions, bring offerings, cheer the entrance of the priestess like she was royalty. Because she was. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman. She was Devi, Lakshmi, Tara, a human vessel for divine femininity. And the king? A temporary Shiva, charged with union, not domination. One foreign diplomat centuries later, long after the rituals faded, described Angkor as the only kingdom. I know where the court beds are more sacred than the court thrones. Of course, not everyone saw it this way. Some records tell of dissent. A general who refused to bow during the ritual. A monk who called the practice a corruption of the Dharma. Both vanished. Political enemies don't tend to survive when gods sleep in your bedroom. And yet, there's a soft story buried in all this grandeur. A quiet tale of 2 lovers, yes, real names lost, but spoken of in temple poetry. He, a young priest in training. She, a temple scribe with ink-stained hands and laughter that made the birds stop mid-flight. Their union wasn't part of any ritual, it broke every rule. But when they were caught, they were not punished. Instead, their story was carved in a hidden corner of a sanctuary. A subtle relief. 2 people, wrapped in nothing but each other, their hands touching, not in lust, but in longing. Maybe the priests recognized something divine in that too. Reminder that sacred doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. And what about the priestesses themselves? Were they willing? Were they chosen? Some scholars argue they were volunteers, women raised from noble families, trained in music, scripture, sensuality. Others claim they were taken, offered by their parents for status or blessing. Perhaps both are true. Power and sacrifice often hold hands. But one foreign account, written by a Chinese envoy in the 13th century, describes a ceremony in which the priestess before union recites a prayer not of submission, but of demand. She calls upon the gods to protect her body, honor her wisdom, and grant her pleasure equal to the king's. That's bold. That's agency. That's someone who understands her role, not as passive recipient, but active divine force. You lean back against the wall, trying to absorb it all. The carvings above. You don't move, but they don't need to. The air itself feels different now, charged, reverent, a little mischievous. Because that's the thing this room whispers in your ear. Pleasure isn't the opposite of devotion. It is devotion. When done with intention, with presence, with respect, it becomes a sacred flame. One that lit empires. One that ruled dynasties. One that echoes, even now, in your own heartbeat. And as you leave the chamber, you take one last glance at the throne. Empty, cold, waiting, not just for a king, but for anyone willing to touch the divine with trembling hands. You step back into the corridor. The drums are silent now, but the temple still hums. And you keep walking. You feel it in the air, now not just heat or history, but a kind of low-frequency hum, like the temple is tuning itself to you. Every step echoes softer, like you're moving through the belly of a great beast that's not entirely asleep. You turn a corner, expecting another shrine, or maybe a forgotten courtyard, but what you find is even stranger. The architecture changes here. The ceilings drop, the corridors bend in odd, intimate angles, and every wall curves inward like a hallway trying to give you a hug, or maybe a nudge. It's subtle at first, then undeniable. The entire layout of this part of the temple is anatomical. You're walking through a metaphor, a body. And not just any body. A woman's body. The symmetry becomes clearer as you move. The outer gate, wide and rising. The long passage narrowing gently. The side chambers like ovaries. The central tower unmistakably phallic. You're not walking toward a shrine. You're approaching the climax, literally. Welcome to the temple as tantric theater. This isn't coincidence. Khmer architects were philosophers in stone, and they didn't just build for function or beauty. They built for meaning. Every angle of Angkor Wat aligns with celestial events. Every pond reflects sacred geometry, and this internal symmetry is no accident. The entire structure mirrors the active sacred union. The temple is the body, the ritual is the breath, and the climax? The divine merging at the central sanctuary, where the lingam waits in shadow. You reach it now, stepping into a chamber where the light filters down like milk through silk. In the center, raised on a lotus pedestal, is the lingam. A smooth, towering stone phallus, perfectly cylindrical, slightly worn by centuries of ceremonial oils. Around its base, a circular yoni, its feminine counterpart, embracing it in eternal union. They don't teach this part on tourist brochures. But here you are, face to face with the god of sacred anatomy. You wonder what the first worshippers felt, kneeling here, offering milk, honey, or their own breath. Did they whisper? Did they tremble? One early account from a 10th century temple log notes that the lingam was bathed daily in lotus milk, garlanded with orchid, and sung to in 6 languages. That's not idol worship. That's intimacy. They didn't just honor the symbol of life. They tended it, like a lover, a child, a secret. The act of pouring milk over the lingam wasn't decorative, it was reenactment. The cosmic semen, blessing the earth. And if that image makes you flinch, remember, this was the sacred. Creation wasn't separate from sex, it was sex. Foucault argued, centuries later, that modernity split the body from power, stripped desire from meaning. But here in Angkor, long before Freud, before church bells replaced gongs, desire was the engine of the world. And it was honored in stone. The walls here are different too, less populated by dancers or warriors, more filled with symbols. Serpents biting their tails, wheels within wheels, the lotus blooming from a sleeping navel. Each image a metaphor. For cycles, rhythm, repetition. This wasn't a one-time show. This was eternal recurrence. The endless dance of union and separation, of yearning and release. You touch one carving, expecting dust or lichen. Instead, you feel heat. Maybe it's the sun. Maybe it's your hand. Maybe it's memory echoing through muscle and mortar. You blink, and suddenly you're no longer alone. You see it now, not ghosts, not visions, but flickers of the past layered over the present like wet ink on old parchment. A procession of priestesses carrying golden urns. A group of children, learning sacred chants. A king, bare-chested, kneeling before the lingam, head bowed not in submission, but in reverence. Then a woman enters the space. She isn't royal. She isn't richly dressed, but the others part for her like silk in the wind. Her body moves slowly, each step like a sentence. She walks to the lingam and places both hands on it, not sexually, not dramatically, just gently, as if greeting an old friend. And for a moment, the temple is still. This, you realize, is the climax of the ritual, not noise, not spectacle, just touch, sacred contact. The meeting of symbol and soul. She closes her eyes. The chant resumes. Somewhere a bell rings, and just as suddenly, the vision fades. You're alone again, but something's changed. The silence feels fuller, like it's holding a story too large for words. And you start to understand why scholars still bicker over what these rituals meant. Some claim it was all symbolic, mere representation. Others insist it was literal, physical union, encoded into ceremony. But maybe the question itself is flawed. Maybe the sacred doesn't fit into binary categories. Maybe these rituals were both metaphor and muscle, both myth and motion. You remember a passage from the Kama Sutra, not the sex guide, the original text, filled with philosophy. Pleasure, when pursued with virtue and mindfulness, becomes a path to the divine. That's not hedonism, that's theology. And here in Angkor, it was state doctrine. The temple itself taught you. Every hallway a nerve, every doorway a breath. The climax chamber not hidden in shame, but placed at the center of it all. You step back, still staring at the lingam, and realize this stone doesn't judge you. It doesn't ask you to be pure or pious. It asks you to be present, to feel, to align. You remember a fringe scholar, half mystic, half linguist, who argued that the Khmer word for temple, prasat, is etymologically linked to words for pulse and center. According to him, the temples weren't houses for gods. They were hearts for the earth, built to throb, built to feel. And the rituals? Just heartbeat sync exercises. You laugh, a little too loudly. A butterfly flits past your head like a soft rebuke. Time to keep moving. But as you turn away, one last detail catches your eye. A small carving, tucked under the pedestal, almost too faint to see. A pair of hands, one male, one female, fingertips barely touching. Between them, a flame. No faces, no bodies, just contact. Just fire. And suddenly, the whole temple makes sense. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a manual, a map, a reminder that somewhere in the meeting of flesh and breath, of touch and tenderness, there lives a truth older than any book, holier than any law. You exhale. The temple exhales with you. You keep walking. You follow a barely visible path now, half crumbled beneath vines and soft dirt, leading you through a side entrance that time has almost erased. The jungle breathes against your neck, warm and sticky, like a secret it wants to whisper, but can't quite trust you with yet. You duck under a sagging lintel where moss has begun to reclaim the sacred stone. And suddenly you find yourself in a chamber so quiet, it makes your own breath sound suspicious. There are no grand reliefs here. No thunderous gods or triumphant kings, just a single raised platform, circular, low to the ground, and carved with floral patterns so intricate they almost pulse. This isn't a hall of power. It's something older, softer, and standing before you now, etched into the back wall, with none of the grandeur or drama of other carvings, is a lone female figure. Naked but not erotic, curved but not coy. Her arms are raised in a gesture, not of offering but of becoming. And you suddenly know exactly what this room is, the priestess chamber. The sanctum of the women who perform the rites not for crowds, not for kings, but for the gods alone. If the king's ritual was spectacle, this was intimacy in its rawest form. These women weren't passive players. They were the pulse of the temple, the literal embodiment of divine energy. Chosen not for beauty, though beauty was common. Not for obedience, though discipline was expected. But for resonance, that unteachable quality that let them move between worlds without losing their minds. You close your eyes, trying to hear what this space once sounded like. Maybe the echo of a chant barely audible. Maybe the swish of silk robes against stone. Maybe nothing but breath, the slow, purposeful inhale and exhale of someone syncing with the sacred. One fringe text, written centuries after the golden age of Angkor, describes a ritual called the Pulse of Devi. It took place on the 7th night of the waxing moon. The chosen priestess would fast for 3 days, bathe in lotus-infused water, and meditate in silence. Then, at midnight, she would be led into this chamber by 4 temple women dressed in white. No music, no speech. Just touch soft fingers on the spine, guiding her to the platform. She would lie down, arms open, and enter a trance. And what followed is written in veiled language. The arrival of the divine male, the thunderous breath, the weaving of opposites. Scholars still debate whether this was metaphor or literal possession, whether a male priest entered the space, or whether the goddess herself did. But one thing is clear, the priestess's body was the site of union, not a vessel, a site. A deliberate, conscious conduit. And when she emerged from trance, she would whisper a single word to the attending priest. That word would become the temple's guiding mantra for the next lunar cycle. Imagine that responsibility. Your body not just honored, but trusted as the voice of divinity. You run your hand along the floral carvings of the platform. They're smooth, worn soft by hundreds of ceremonies. This stone held generations of breath, of tension, of surrender. You wonder how it felt to give yourself over not to a lover, not to a man, but to presence. To let yourself dissolve into something beyond body and still return whole. And then comes the story they don't tell on tours, the priestess who refused. Her name is lost, but the legend lingers like incense. She was chosen young, trained to perfection, and yet when the time came, she said no. Not out of rebellion, not out of fear, but because, as she whispered, the gods already live in me. I do not need to be opened. I am already door. They exiled her, of course, called her arrogant, cursed. But 10 years later, when the temple fell under plague and famine, it was said that her prayers offered from the forest brought back the rains. Some believe she was the last true Devi. Others say she was never real. But you feel her here, in this quiet. In the unapologetic way the stone still breathes, even without incense or chant. And maybe that's the most sacred truth of all some. Rooms don't need ritual to be holy. They just need memory. There's another odd detail that catches your eye. A shelf carved directly into the wall, holding what looks like miniature oil wells indentations, each about the size of a palm. Some still carry blackened residue. And right below, a line of script worn nearly invisible. You lean in, squinting. And there it is. Offer only the scent that lives in skin. Not flowers, not fruit. Skin. These weren't offerings to the gods. They were echoes of touch, traces of presence. The smell of the priestess herself, imprinted through oil and time. Imagine centuries of such scents, warm, human, alive, burned slowly in ritual to remind the gods of their own longing. That's the thing about these rites. They weren't about fireworks or spectacle. They were about detail, precision, presence so deep it left fingerprints in stone. One anecdote from Peter Webb's writings describes a priestess who never spoke, allowed in ritual. Instead, she breathed words into the chest of the initiate softly, rhythmically, until his heartbeat matched her own. They called her the Whisper. Men traveled for weeks just to be seen by her once, not touched, just seen, because her gaze, it was said, stripped you down to your truest self. You wonder now how many of these women knew the power they carried. How many fought for it, protected it, passed it down in secret even after the rituals faded. One line from Foucault keeps echoing. Power is not only repressive, it is productive. And here, in these quiet chambers, that power wasn't imposed. It was grown, from the inside out. You stand and look back one more time. The carvings don't dance. The air doesn't shimmer. But something leans toward you, not in menace, in invitation. A reminder that sacredness isn't always found in gods or kings, but in breath, touch, refusal, and the quiet power of women who became rituals themselves. You walk on, the silence richer now, your steps slower. The temple still lives, and she remembers. You emerge from the priestess chamber as if waking from a shared dream, your skin still tingling with borrowed echoes. The light outside has shifted brighter, harsher, more real, but something inside you resists the return. Your eyes adjust slowly, just in time to notice another structure rising ahead, squat and square like a forgotten altar. You approach, expecting more of the same carvings, corridors, reverent silence. But instead, you find something so blunt, so shockingly literal, it stops you cold. In the center of this chamber sits a massive stone pillar, thick, smooth, and unmistakably phallic. No metaphor, no subtlety. Just power pure, vertical, unapologetic. And surrounding it, small channels carved into the floor, leading toward a basin shaped like an open lotus. You realize this isn't a display, it's plumbing, ritual plumbing. The pillar is a lingam, yes, but not decorative. It was functional. Bathed, anointed, and drained daily. This is where sacred fluids were collected: milk, oil, honey, possibly even semen. Offerings and enactments flowing into the lotus yoni. The gods, it seems, appreciated both poetry and practicality. You step closer, and a strange sensation washes over you, part awe, part unease. Because it's one thing to read about symbolism. It's another to stand before a 3-foot phallus that a civilization literally fed. You can't help but picture it. Temple attendants arriving at dawn, chanting softly as they warm the oils, climb the stairs, and pour them gently, lovingly, over the stone. Every drop a prayer, every spill a prophecy. And somewhere in the background, a scribe noting the temperature, the consistency, the flow. Sex here was systematized, not repressed, not hidden, documented. Foucault would have lost his mind. Historians still argue whether the daily bathing of the lingam was symbolic or sensual. But even skeptics admit the frequency, the care, and the sheer manpower involved point to something deeper than ritual. This wasn't a side ceremony. It was the main act. And here's the kicker: this stone lingam, found in nearly every major Khmer temple, wasn't always alone. Some temples featured dual installations, one for the gods, one for the king, both bathed, both worshipped, sometimes simultaneously. You wonder if the people watching made distinctions between sacred and state, or if in that world, the two were one and the same. It makes sense when you consider how Khmer cosmology framed kingship. The king wasn't just divinely chosen. He became divine. His body was a map of the cosmos. His breath mirrored the monsoon cycle. His seed, when ritually spent, was a national asset. So the lingam didn't just represent fertility, it enacted it. A sacred totem of generative force. And not just male power, either. The yoni base, the receiving circle, was equally honored. Both were needed. One without the other was just sculpture. But together, they were life, creation, balance. You reach out and touch the stone. It's warm, unnervingly so. Not from sun, from use, from memory. And for a second, you picture the strangest scene, one you would have scoffed at yesterday. A team of priests humming softly as they polish the lingam before a ceremony, carefully massaging oil in circular patterns, murmuring blessings not out of duty, but out of devotion. A fringe historian once claimed the Khmer believed the gods had erogenous zones, not out of absurdity, but as a metaphor for spiritual receptivity. To please the gods, you had to please the form of the gods. The lingam wasn't a statue, it was a spine, a pillar through which divine energy flowed. You laugh quietly, thinking of modern temples with locked doors and velvet ropes. Here, the divine was hands-on, tactile, trusting, and yes, a little bit awkward to talk about at dinner. But you're not here for dinner. You're here for truth. And the truth is this: the Khmer didn't flinch at embodiment. They honored it. They etched it into stone. And while other civilizations cloaked their myths in metaphor, Angkor's myths walked around naked, anointed, and humming with meaning. One story, half legend and half recorded, tells of a lingam that cracked during an earthquake. The priests were devastated. They called upon craftsmen, astrologers, even elephants to help lift and mend it, but nothing worked. Until an elderly woman, said to be the last living priestess of a lost sect, came forward. She didn't speak. She simply climbed onto the platform, placed her hands on the crack, and began to sing. No one remembers the words, but by sunrise, the stone was whole again. Coincidence, some say. Magic, others whisper. But perhaps it was something else: recognition. A body remembering another body. A wound responding to warmth. Another tidbit most tourists miss: these lingam sites weren't isolated. They were surrounded by what we'd now call pleasure gardens, lush, curated spaces with flowers known for their aphrodisiac scents, soft grassy beds, shaded alcoves. It wasn't indulgence. It was preparation. The idea was simple. Beauty invites reverence. The more the senses opened, the easier it was to feel divine presence. The temple didn't just seduce the gods, it seduced you. You remember a passage from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, describing a medieval French queen's bedroom as part cathedral, part boudoir, filled with incense, relics, and erotic paintings. It's not so different here. The Khmer just removed the shame from the equation. They knew what all good lovers know: the environment matters. Set the stage, soften the light, anoint the air, and even stone begins to sing. You sit on the edge of the basin, watching sunlight drip down the chamber walls like slow honey. The shadows move gently, like they're breathing. And in that stillness you begin to hear it again, the pulse. That steady, sacred rhythm of body meeting body, of God meeting form. Not pounding, not rushing. Just deep, present, unafraid. You wonder what it would feel like to live in a world where that rhythm guided everything. Where daily worship began with breath, touch, and intention. Where sacredness wasn't hidden in books but carved into your city, your routines, your skin. You stand slowly, one last glance at the stone. You think about how many hands have touched it, not worshiping from afar, but up close. Offering not just words, but warmth. And you realize this isn't ancient. This isn't obsolete. It's just forgotten. Covered in dust, buried under giggles and academic caution. But it's still here, still humming, still waiting for someone to remember that the sacred doesn't live in hiding. It lives in touch. And you? You keep walking. You move now like someone carrying a secret. Not in haste, not in fear, but with that quiet reverence reserved for people who've seen too much to ever be quite the same. The temple shifts again, less architectural, more anatomical. You're not exploring a building anymore. You're navigating a body, a memory, a dream with bones of stone. And then, out of nowhere, you step into a small courtyard bathed in golden light. You blink. Because standing at the center, posed in full mid-stride like he might leap off the pedestal and finish what he started, is a figure both regal and radiant, crowned, bejeweled, strong of limb and soft of gaze. A Khmer king. Not just any king. This is Jayavarman VII. You've heard his name whispered like a prayer and muttered like a curse. The king who built more temples than some gods, who bled for his people in battle, and who, if the stories are true, slept not in a bed, but on a shrine. And tonight, we're going into his bedroom. Or rather, the temple chamber that doubled as one. Because here's the thing that textbooks mumble and tour guides skip. Jayavarman VII wasn't just an empire builder. He was a cosmic bridegroom. A man whose love life wasn't private or personal, it was political, ritualized, and recorded. Every night, under the gaze of stone gods and mortal advisors, he reenacted the marriage of heaven and earth. And by marriage, we don't mean metaphor, we mean sex. Not pleasure-seeking, not indulgence, but duty. Sacred union with a priestess chosen not by lust, but by lineage, lunar cycle, and spiritual readiness. This ritual, known in some sources as the binding of light, took place deep within the Bayon temple, behind doors carved with apsaras so fluid they seemed to breathe. The king would enter after fasting and meditation, clothed in a single piece of white silk. The priestess, draped in nothing but jasmine petals and prayer symbols, would kneel beside the lingam altar. Then, under torchlight and chanting, the two would join not hurriedly, not passionately, but with deliberate, choreographed grace. Every touch had meaning. Every movement, a mantra. One palm on the shoulder, the invocation of Vishnu. Fingers on the belly, the awakening of the cosmic fire. Lips to lips, the breath of Brahma shared. This was not a seduction, it was a summoning. They believed that through this union, the balance of the kingdom was restored, that their bodies echoed the universe itself, masculine and feminine energies, merging to sustain not just crops and rain, but morality, order, and peace. The very bones of Angkor were held together by these midnight prayers in motion. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated to reinforce divine right. Some say they were symbolic, others insist they were quite literal. But then you see the architectural evidence rooms, built with privacy in mind, acoustics that carry chant like a whisper over water, ceremonial basins for washing post-union. And of course, the poetry carved into obscure corners. One fragment reads, "She held my seed as the moon holds tide, and the sun rose kinder the next day." That's not politics. That's something else. And who was this priestess really? She wasn't a queen in the Western sense. She was a divine consort, trained from childhood in ritual, medicine, dance, and astronomy. Her role was not to bear heirs, but to bear balance. She was both woman and goddess, chosen to channel cosmic feminine force. It was said that she never walked, she glided. That her voice calmed fever. That she could bring water to dry fields. With a single chant if her heart was aligned. And alignment was everything. Before each union, both king and priestess underwent purification. Physical, mental, emotional. They were not allowed to speak for hours before the rite. They consumed only lotus root and honey water. Because when they met, they were expected to do more than perform. They were to transform. And if either hesitated, if the breath wasn't right or the chant stumbled, the ritual would be called off. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. A European missionary once mocked the ceremony in his journal, calling it barbaric theater. But his guide, an old temple servant, simply replied, "You watch with your eyes, we listen with our skin." You pause, thinking of that. Listening with your skin. How foreign, how wild, how oddly familiar. Because don't we all crave that? To be met fully, touched wholly, seen beyond the mask, Jayavarman wasn't just having sacred sex. He was becoming permeable, vulnerable, divine. And that, perhaps, was his real power. Not in swords or shrines, but in his willingness to surrender to something bigger than himself. Not every ritual went smoothly, of course. One story tells of a storm breaking out mid-rite, thunder shaking the temple, torches blown out. The king stopped mid-motion, trembling. The priestess reached up, touched his cheek, and whispered, "You do not need to finish. The gods have already entered." He wept. Not from shame, from awe. Later that year, the harvest was unusually abundant. And in his memoirs, if the stone fragments can be called, that he wrote only this: "That night, I gave nothing. And in return, everything was given." You stand now where he once stood, facing the chamber. It's smaller than you imagined. More intimate. You can see where the torch holders were carved, where the offering bowls sat, where feet would have pressed again and again into the same smooth groove. This wasn't spectacle. This was repetition. Ceremony as muscle memory. Love as statcraft. And then, you see it, etched into the far wall, almost invisible in the shifting light. A small diagram stick figures, almost playful. A king, a priestess. Between them, a spiral. Beneath it, one line. When the body becomes still, the stars realign. You step closer, tracing the line. The stone is worn, but not broken. As if the memory insists on staying. And maybe that's the real legacy of Jayavarman's sacred bedroom. Not conquest, not temples, but this quiet truth. The world doesn't change from declarations or armies. It changes when two people, stripped of ego and fear, meet each other fully and let the sacred move through them. You turn away gently, heart fuller, spine looser, like your own breath just cinched with something older than time. And you walk on. You round another corner now, deeper into the belly of this ancient desire engine. And the walls here don't play coy anymore. They shout, they tempt. They unfold like some kind of divine graphic novel that no scribe dared to read aloud in polite company. The carvings are larger, bolder, and frankly, not even trying to be subtle. At first glance, it's chaos. Limbs entangled, torsos doubled, bodies coiled around each other in mathematically impossible intimacy. You lean in closer, and the details bloom like wild orchids. Couples, trios, entire clusters of figures in. Swirling arrangements of flesh and hair and eye contact, so intense it could shatter mirrors. But the more you look, the more you realize this isn't pornography. This is choreography. A liturgy of the erotic. This, dear listener, is the Khmer Kama Sutra in stone. No scrolls. No paper. Just walls that dared to remember what most cultures spend centuries trying to forget. These erotic murals aren't scattered, they're strategic. Aligned with astrological markers, placed at certain intersections of the temple where light hits just so at solstice or equinox. The effect is stunning. One pair of figures, a man with a lion's mane, a woman mid-arch like she's flying, seem to glow when the sun reaches a specific angle in the afternoon. Light and shadow turn their union into movement. Their stone breath becomes yours. Historians still argue whether these carvings were literal representations of temple practices or symbolic guides to cosmic unity. Some call it tantric instruction. Others say it was temple gossip immortalized. But one thing is clear. These carvings weren't meant to be hidden. They were placed where every passerby pilgrim, priest, or peasant would see them. Not as titillation, as teaching. Because in the Khmer worldview, sexual union was not just allowed, it was required. To neglect pleasure was to disrespect the gods who gave it. To touch with reverence was to pray. One fringe theory even suggests that some of these scenes were instructional panels, like spiritual IKEA diagrams for royal couples or initiates. A whisper from the past saying, "This is how you merge with the divine. Start here, move like this. Breathe like that." You linger at one scene in particular. A reclining figure with 4 arms, 2 cradling a lover, 2 playing a flute. Around them, birds, flowers, a serpent curled protectively. The expression on their faces isn't lustful, it's serene, satisfied in a way that transcends the body. You realize this isn't about climax, it's about connection. The slow surrender of separateness. And just below the scene, a small inscription. Where there is no shame, there is no end. You're not sure what it means, but it follows you as you step into the next chamber. Here, the carvings turn playful. A woman pulling her lover's hair. A god laughing as a mortal tries and fails to untie her robe. Even a monkey, perched like a nosy neighbor, peeking between 2 statues mid-embrace. The humor isn't vulgar, it's knowing. As if the stone itself remembers how ridiculous, how divine, how achingly human desire can be. And yet, there's reverence beneath the mischief. The figures are powerful, confident, never victimized, never shamed. Every pose is chosen, every glance returned. There's even a carving of 2 women embracing under a tree, legs intertwined like vines. No man in sight, just the moon overhead and their joy written in their eyes. A scholar once tried to erase this carving from a colonial photograph, said it was deviant. The stone disagreed. It's still here, still smiling. And somewhere, nearby, you can almost hear the rustle of silk, the muffled laughter, the breath held mid-surrender. There's a curious paradox to all of this. These scenes are graphic, yes, but they're also sacred. Erotic, but not exploitative. They suggest that maybe the problem isn't with desire itself, but with the way we've come to fear it. Sanitize it. Strip it of its divine fingerprints. Here, it's as holy as incense. One of the more obscure carvings shows a figure mid-transformation, half human, half animal, locked in an embrace that seems more ritual than romantic. Some believe it's symbolic of merging human instinct with divine consciousness. Others think it represents a taboo myth long lost to oral tradition. Either way, it demands attention, and interpretation, and discomfort. Which is probably the point. Because what is sacred if not the thing that challenges us most? You pause now in front of a wall that's entirely blank, as if the carver stopped mid-story and left the rest to time. But a single symbol rests in the corner, a lotus folded over a flame. You don't know what it means, but it feels like a punctuation mark. A quiet gasp at the end of a sentence spoken through centuries of flesh and stone. You sit for a moment, letting the air settle around you. The room is warm, thick with light and memory. And you think of the people who walk these halls before you, temple dancers, royal lovers, nervous initiates tracing stone positions with unsure fingers. Not sinners, not deviants, but seekers, explorers of the divine through the only vessel. They had their bodies. You think of how many times the world has tried to silence this kind of knowing. Burned it, banished it, buried it under robes and doctrines, and whispered shame. And yet here it is, laughing in stone, glowing in sun, unrepentant, unashamed, unfinished. A final story drifts into your memory, one told in fragments by an old monk who once served as a guide here. He spoke of a queen who, every spring, would walk these erotic halls barefoot and alone. Not to remember, but to feel. She'd pause at each scene, close her eyes, and inhale deeply. And when asked why, she replied, "The gods never ask us to look away, only to look deeper." You open your eyes now. The carvings don't move. But they're not still either. They live in you. You keep walking. The temple tightens around you again, the air thicker, heavier, almost humid with anticipation. You've seen the gods demanding pleasure, the kings performing cosmic foreplay, the priestesses whispering mantras through their skin. But now you're about to enter a different school. One where the students are not deities or royalty, but women trained in the art of sacred seduction, not as a game, but as a curriculum. You step into a long corridor with walls lined in recessed alcoves, each holding a bas-relief of a woman mid-dance, mid-glance, mid-spell. Some hold instruments, others scrolls, others mirrors. This, you realize, is the gallery of the courtesans, the hidden university where Khmer women studied not only movement and music, but medicine, politics, and the metaphysics of pleasure. These weren't prostitutes. They were priestesses with curriculum vitae. The royal courtesan was a paradox wrapped in jasmine and silk, obedient yet influential, quiet yet strategic, desired yet untouchable without invitation. Their training began young, often before the age of 10, under the guidance of elder mistresses who were equal parts tutor, mystic, and military commander. The lessons weren't just about dance or charm. They were about reading a man's heartbeat from the flicker of his eyelid, about decoding a courtly insult woven into poetry, about turning the art of touch into an act of diplomacy. One legend speaks of a courtesan named Samaya, who once disarmed a political assassin with nothing but her voice. She sang to him as he raised his blade, and by the final note, he was crying in her lap. He became a monk the next week. Samaya was promoted. In the writings of Peter Webb, there's mention of an ancient Khmer text, now lost, that described the 9 temples of the body. Each temple represented a part of the female form, and each was to be honored with ritual, not rushed. With desire. This text was memorized, embodied, and taught by the elite courtesans. They didn't just teach princes how to please. They taught them how to perceive. Because in Khmer ideology, pleasure wasn't indulgence, it was refinement. The ability to give and receive pleasure with awareness, with control, with grace, was seen as a sign of intelligence and emotional maturity. You find yourself thinking of the modern world, where sex is often either commodified or condemned. Here, it was cultivated, elevated, practiced like an art, mastered like a martial form. These women could recite entire hymns backwards while maintaining eye contact and balance on one foot. They could apply scented oils to a man's back in patterns that corresponded to astrological cycles. They knew which syllables to whisper to lull the heart, and which to chant to wake the serpent energy coiled at the base of the spine. And yes, some of them were spies. You pass a carving of a woman holding what looks like a lotus, but upon closer inspection is a disguised scroll. Intelligence disguised as innocence, power cloaked in perfume. One historian refers to the temple courtesan network as the kingdom's soft surveillance system. If you wanted to know what a general feared, ask the woman he spent the night with. But this wasn't manipulation. It was orchestration. These women weren't using sex to get power. They used power to restore balance. If a prince grew too proud, his assigned courtesan would remind him, gently, erotically, of humility. If a foreign envoy underestimated Khmer refinement, he'd leave with softened eyes and trembling hands. There's even an apocryphal story of a Chinese ambassador who tried to impose a trade agreement by force. Instead of threats, the court sent a trio of courtesans trained in the 5 harmonies. They entertained him for 7 nights. On the 8th, he tore up the contract and offered silk instead of soldiers. The women returned to the temple. The agreement was honored for 20 years. You turn a corner now and find a low platform scattered with petals and cracked tiles, what remains of a training hall. The walls are scrawled with faint instructional diagrams. One shows hand gestures. Another maps pressure points on the body. Like constellations, the final one is simply titled Breath, a reminder that everything sacred begins there. And everything profane, too. You sit on the edge of the platform, imagining what it must have been like, the rustle of silk, the hush of bare feet, the whispered corrections from the elder mistress. No, not there, there. You don't need to understand the language to hear the rhythm. One breath, one pulse, one undivided presence. And perhaps that's the secret the courtesans guarded. Not just the technique of touch, but the art of attention. In a world ruled by conquest and expansion, they offered the radical power of presence. To be here, to feel fully, to hold a gaze long enough for the other to become God, if only for a moment. Foucault once noted that knowledge and sexuality are never truly separate, they define each other. The Khmer courtesans lived that truth. Their bodies were libraries, and every movement was a footnote. Their work wasn't transactional, it was transformational. You rise slowly, aware now of how much you've been holding in your own body tension. In the jaw, stiffness in the shoulders, that chronic ache behind the eyes that modern life trains us to ignore. The temple seems to notice. A breeze moves through the corridor, stirring old petals. A carving catches your eye, one of a woman cradling a man's face as he weeps into her lap. Not seduction. Not climax, just witnessing, just stillness. And you wonder how many battles could have been prevented if more people were trained to sit like that, to hold space like that, to love without agenda. You pass the final alcove, where a small stone basin still carries the scent of dried jasmine and something metallic. Maybe oil, maybe time. You bow slightly instinctively. Not because you were told to, but because some rooms deserve your softness. You exit the corridor changed, not in how you think about sex, but in how you think about knowing. About what it means to learn not just with the mind, but with the entire body. And somewhere behind you, the echoes of laughter, chanting, and whispered syllables still float, weaving through the air like incense, smoke, and moonlight. The courtesans don't ask for thanks, just remembrance. You keep walking. You walk until the stones begin to feel different, less ceremonial, more worn, like a hallway that's been walked in silence by people who carried secrets in their veins. The scent changes too. Less jasmine now, more muskin. Age, you inhale, and it hits you not the fragrance, but the silence. A different kind of silence. Not reverent, not holy, but guilty. You're entering the part of the temple they don't talk about. The part that got left out of the official inscriptions and tour guides. The part that whispers about what happens when sacred sex goes sideways. Because behind every golden ritual and royal coupling, there are shadows. And tonight, you're going to sit with them. Welcome to the underbelly. The hallway opens into a series of small chambers, each carved with reliefs so faint, they almost look erased. You look closer and realize these aren't faint from time. They've been deliberately rubbed out, whole scenes sanded into ambiguity. Faces scratched, groins chiseled, as if someone somewhere was desperate to unsee. See, this is where the secrets of the sacred bedrooms were buried. The aftermath, the accidents, the diseases, the consequences, and the denials. Because even in a world where sex was sacred, not all of it was consensual, clean, or controllable. Let's talk about the sacred STDs. You read that right. For all their metaphysics, the Khmer weren't immune to biology. Records found in temple medical texts describe skin lesions, fevers, genital sores, and what they called flower rot. Poetic euphemism for what modern doctors would recognize as advanced syphilis. Ritual unions came with real risks. The priestesses were expected to purify, yes, but not even jasmine oil can kill a bacterium. One account tells of a priestess who fell ill weeks after a ritual. Her skin paled, her breath soured, her limbs ached. When the physicians failed to cure her, she was sent to the forest to rebalance her humors. She never returned. Her name was not recorded, but her room is still here, cold, empty, untouched. You feel it now, that queasy tension like stepping behind the stage of a beautiful performance and seeing the blood-stained costumes. Because while the temple exalted sexuality, it also policed it. There were rules, rules with consequences. Courtesans who broke ritual timing were punished with isolation. Kings who initiated union without celestial alignment were said to anger the rain gods. And monks, yes, monks, who broke their vows were either defrocked or disappeared. There's a story buried in a crumbling monk's diary about a brother named Tiff. He was a healer, a chanter, and a man of strict discipline until the night he watched a ritual from behind the curtains. He wrote, "The god entered her, and I forgot which god was mine." Days later, he left his robes folded neatly on the temple steps. No one saw him again. But temple rumors say he lived in exile, tending to a secret sect of priestesses who believed union was a form of devotion the monks should never have been denied. Fringe historians love this story, orthodox ones hate it. But the fact that it exists, carved inside columns and whispered in water jars, tells you something. That even in a society that sanctified the body, there were fractures, discomforts, hypocrisies. One carving shows a figure, unmistakably female, being pulled between two male gods. Her expression is blank, her body limp. Unlike the other scenes, this one has no balance, no joy, just tension. And yet, it wasn't erased. It was tucked away, a confession in stone. You think of the women who didn't get to choose. The ones offered to temples by families seeking divine favor. The ones who bled after rituals and were told it meant the gods had blessed them. The ones who were never named. This is their hallway, their story. And it deserves space too. Because reverence without responsibility is just romanticized violence. And a sacred duty, when forced, becomes sacred trauma. Still, the temple tried to fix what it could. They developed medicinal bombs, some made from fermented rice, others from crushed herbs and crocodile dung. Yes, you heard right, crocodile dung. Applied externally to treat divine burns, which were likely infections or irritation from overuse and undercare. Another text describes a form of ritual celibacy for courtesans recovering from illness. They were not shamed, they were celebrated, given new robes, allowed to chant. Their abstinence became another offering. Not a punishment, but a pivot. Not silence, but song in another key. Still, the tension lingered. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the chamber you're about to enter next. It's low-ceilinged, dimly lit, and completely covered floor to ceiling in carvings of eyes. Eyes of gods, eyes of mortals. Eyes without faces, watching, judging, witnessing. This scholars believe was the chamber of penance. Where temple members, priestesses, monks, kings even came to confess breaches of sacred protocol. Not just who touched whom, but when and why. Timing mattered. Intention mattered. Consent mattered. Not to the law, but to the gods. One inscription reads, "I entered without blessing, and so the seed was ash." You sit in the center of the room and feel them, the eyes. They don't blink, they don't accuse, but they do see. And maybe that's the deepest fear of all, not divine punishment, but divine perception. The knowing that no matter how beautiful the ritual, how poetic the touch, if the heart wasn't aligned, the gods knew. And so did the walls. You think now of Foucault's idea that power is sustained not through force, but through constant visibility. The panopticon. The temple, too, was a panopticon of passion. You weren't just seen by others. You were seen by the stone. And when your desire slipped from sacred to selfish, from union to conquest, the carvings did not forgive. They just remembered. A final story comes to mind, told by a modern-day temple caretaker, a woman, whose great-grandmother served as the last known apprentice priestess before the colonial bans. She said, "The temple doesn't punish, but it mirrors. If you come with love, it shows you beauty. If you come with hunger, it shows you hunger." And maybe that's what this hallway is for, not shame, but mirroring. To remind us that sacredness isn't about perfection. It's about presence. About owning the tremble in your hands when you touch someone with more power than you've earned. about saying I wasn't ready, or I went too far, or even I'm still learning. Because even stone can soften when truth is spoken inside it. You rise, knees stiff, heart heavier. The hallway opens again, and the carvings return to grace, to symmetry, to stories of gods and lovers in balance. But now you see the shadows behind the glow, the costs behind the rituals. The breath held a little too long. And you keep walking. You step back into light, but it doesn't feel like freedom. Not yet. The sun dapples through cracked stone lattice, casting patterns on the floor like a net of gold and shadow. You pause. Because just ahead is a corridor. You haven't entered yet, narrow, almost claustrophobic, yet unmistakably ceremonial. The walls are smoother here, the carvings gentler, more delicate. This isn't the path of kings or priestesses or courtesans. This is the path of the offered, the gifted. The girls who were given, not asked. You walk slowly, your footsteps softened by time and moss. Because here's the truth most histories dodge like a knife. Not all temple women entered by choice. Some were offerings. Sacred, yes. Voluntary, not always. When crops failed or stars misaligned, families, especially those in rural villages, were known to bring daughters to the temple gates. Not to abandon them, but to elevate them. That's how they saw it. The ultimate sacrifice, the highest gift. Give your daughter to the gods, and they might give you rain. You might get a vision. You might, just might, get mercy. And so these girls, some as young as 7, were left with bundles of rice, silk, and blessings. The temple received them like it did all offerings, with ritual, incense, and an official record etched in stone. One inscription, still legible in a side alcove, reads, "She came with the breath of her mother on her hair, and left with the voice of the goddess in her mouth." Poetic, but also uncomfortable. You wonder how many of these girls understood what was being asked of them. They were renamed, reclothed, retrained. Their bodies no longer family property, but temple domain. They learned to bow, to chant, to move in patterns that pleased not men, but gods. At least, that's what they were told. But somewhere in between the incense and mantras, their childhoods floated away like ash on river wind. One temple nurse's record, found scratched behind a basin, describes a young girl named Kea who would cry every morning before her oil bath. She wasn't sick. She wasn't defiant. She just missed her older brother. She didn't remember his name, just that he smelled like mangoes and sang while fishing. And that, more than any scroll, tells you what was lost. But these girls weren't victims in the modern sense. That's too easy a label. They were initiated, elevated, trained in literacy, ritual, dance, astronomy. By 17, some wielded more influence than village chiefs. They could perform rites, read omens, and correct royal posture with a single look. They were holy. They were revered. But they were not free. One of the most haunting carvings you find here isn't erotic. It's quiet. A girl kneels before a row of older women. Her hands are raised, her head bowed. Her face is blank. The older women look both kind and stern. The title above them reads, "The Ceremony of Acceptance." Below it, a single sentence. She no longer belongs to the world. She becomes its bridge. That's a beautiful idea until you realize what it cost. And yet, some of these offered girls grew into legends. There's one tale of a temple woman named Nira who, after decades in service, led an entire district. Through a famine using nothing but ritual, herbal knowledge, and the force of her will. When she died, she was cremated not as a priestess, but as a queen. Her ashes scattered at the base of the temple's sacred fig tree. They say the tree still blooms twice a year instead of once. Another story tells of Slyly, who was said to sing songs that made stone soften. She never took a partner, never spoke outside of ritual, but when a warlord tried to desecrate the temple, she stood on the steps and sang until he dropped his weapon. He left in silence, later became a monk. And then there's the story of a girl named Dara. She arrived at the temple at age 8, terrified and mute. No one could get her to speak. For 2 years, she worked in silence, learned the rituals, followed orders. Then one night, during a moon festival, she walked into the central shrine and began to dance. Not the prescribed forms, not the sanctioned poses, her own dance, wild, fluid, unrepeatable. She didn't speak, she just moved. The elders tried to stop her. The priests panicked. But the high priestess, near blind and nearing death, watched quietly. And when Dara finished, the elder whispered, "The gods have returned." That was the last festival ever held at that temple. Not out of fear, out of fulfillment. It's easy to feel rage for these girls, easy to pity them. But they would not want your pity. They would want your listening. They would want you to understand that sacred doesn't always mean painless. That sacrifice isn't always martyrdom. That sometimes, a girl given to the gods becomes something more than either side expected. But still, you must hold space for the other truth. That these systems, no matter how ornate or justified, carried wounds. There were girls who didn't rise, who wilted, who broke under the weight of expectation. One scribe's note barely. A footnote in a corner of a stone wall mentions a darkening of the spirit among younger initiates during a particular decade. He writes, "Some forget themselves. Some do not return from trance. Some begin to bleed and never stop." And that line, "Some do not return from trance," it sticks to your skin. Because trance was a tool, a sacred one. These girls were trained to leave their bodies so gods could enter. But what happens when you leave too often? What happens when the gods take up permanent residence in a space that used to be you? Number. One carved the answer, but you feel it in the walls. The stone sighs here. It doesn't sing. You walk slowly now, past empty alcoves and faded names, past jasmine petals long dried into the dust. And at the end of the corridor, a single carving hidden, almost forgotten. A girl sits cross-legged, eyes closed, smiling slightly. A single flower rests in her lap. The title above, "She belongs to herself." That, more than any chant or oil or ritual, is the most sacred image you've seen all night. You exhale, the air feels cleaner, the silence less sharp. You keep walking. The temple shifts again, as if rolling over in its sleep. You follow the curve of a passage that narrows like a throat, until the air grows damp and slightly sweet, with that telltale scent of water and age. This chamber is lower than the rest, sunken into the earth, as though someone wanted to bury it without filling it in. And when you step inside, the carvings stop pretending to be polite. You blink twice to be sure. Yes, that's a man with an elephant's head doing things you didn't think stone could depict. That's a woman with wings locked in a pose that defies gravity and shame. And that, over there in the corner, is something part man, part snake, entangled with 2 people. 3, you lose count, you've found it. The chamber of animal sex gods and forbidden's flesh. And it's not what you think. These are primitive perversions, they're myths. Sacred ones, woven from a cosmology where the boundaries between human, animal, and divine were not fixed fences but silk curtains. Curtains meant to be drawn back. This was a culture that believed in shapeshifters not as fantasy, but as theology. In Khmer iconography, gods often take animal forms not because they are beasts, but because they transcend singular form. To be divine was to be multiple. And to be multiple meant, yes, sometimes having hooves and hunger in the same breath. Take the god Hanuman, part monkey, part man, all mischief. In some versions of the Ramayana, he's not just a loyal servant. He's a seducer, a flirt, a playful force of vitality that swings between genders and species with ease. One lesser-known temple mural shows Hanuman surrounded by female dancers, not ogling them, but mimicking them. And they're laughing, not threatened, not punished. It's a celebration of mimicry as reverence, fluidity as power. The implication is clear. Sacred doesn't have to be static. Now look at Ganesha. Yes, the elephant-headed god of wisdom and beginnings. But did you know some tantric sects worshipped him as a fertility deity? One 12th century Khmer relief shows Ganesha seated with two consorts, their legs draped over his lap, each feeding him something honey, perhaps, or breath. His trunk curls not in gluttony, but in devotion. Pleasure, here, is knowledge made tactile. To indulge the senses is not to betray wisdom, but to deepen it. You can almost hear the old temple scholar muttering, "But what about morality?" And the temple, with a stone shrug, replies, "What about complexity? The stories carved in this room are layered." Yes, there are scenes of erotic union between gods and animals, humans and spirits, hybrids and shadows. But they're not cheap spectacle. They're cautionary tales, metaphors, riddles for the initiate to decode. One carving shows a woman embraced by a serpent man, her eyes closed in bliss. Beneath them, a broken chain. Scholars debate, is it a tale of liberation through desire, or a warning about temptation disguised as divinity? The answer is yes. It's both. These stories weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be felt, to disrupt, to challenge, to sit in your gut like unripe fruit. Take the tale of the bull god and the night dancer. She was mortal, he was celestial. Their love was forbidden not because of species, but because she danced with too much fire. It's said she once spun so fast during a ritual, she caught flame. Literally. Her body burned, but she didn't stop. The bull god, moved by her defiance, descended to earth and kissed her. That kiss turned her to ash, and from the ash, lotus flowers bloomed. The moral? No one agrees. Some say it's about passion that consumes. Others say it's about the beauty of uncontainable feminine energy. Still others think it's a coded tale about sacrifice and transformation. But everyone remembers the image, the kiss that burns and blooms, the duality of it, pleasure and destruction, desire and transcendence. That's the current running through this whole chamber. The idea that sacred intimacy isn't always safe. That sometimes, to touch the divine, you have to risk the monstrous. Another carving shows a woman riding a lion not astride, but curled into its mane, whispering into its ear. Her body is relaxed, but the lion's eyes are wide. Beneath the image, a line. She teaches the beast to weep. That hits you somewhere. You weren't expecting. Because for all the animal forms and wild mythologies, the through line isn't brutality. It's tenderness. The sacred feminine in these stories isn't a passive recipient or a fearful damsel. She's the one who tames gods, seduces spirits, and transforms monsters, not through domination, but through presence, through seeing, through embracing what even the divine fears in itself. You start to understand why this chamber was built. Underground, away from the tourists and moralists. It's not because it's profane. It's because it's too honest, too layered, too unwilling to be summarized. Here, sacredness isn't about purity, it's about wholeness. About letting the wild, the weird, the wretched parts of yourself into the light and asking them, what do you want to teach me? One modern myth, passed down by temple caretakers and rarely shared outside Cambodia, tells of a woman who came to this chamber during a full moon and spent the night alone. She brought no offerings, just questions. When she left at dawn, her hair had turned silver. She lived another 30 years and never spoke of what she saw. But every year, on that same moon, she returned and placed a single flower on the serpent carving. They say the flower never wilted. You move slowly now, tracing the edges of a figure with 4 faces and no eyes. It's neither male nor female, neither god nor beast. It's something else, something unnamed. And maybe that's the final secret of this place. The divine can't be boxed. It wriggles out of categories, changes shape mid-sentence. kisses you with tusks and licks your wounds with feathers. It terrifies and heals. It shamas and exalts. It does not apologize. You step back into the main hall and feel taller, stranger, as if some ancient part of you has been dusted off and handed back, not to carry like a burden, but to remember. Because until you face the sacred in its wildest forms, its fur, its fang, its fever, you haven't really seen it. And the temple knows that. That's why it built this room, not to shock you, but to test whether your reverence has room for discomfort. You walk on, different now. Not cleaner, but more complete. You barely step 2 feet out of the underworld when the atmosphere snaps like a silk thread pulled too tight. The air shifts again, not with incense, not with memory, but with surveillance. You're still in the same temple, yes, but it no longer feels like a place of worship. It feels like a stage, and you're being watched. Not by gods this time, but by mortals, jealous ones, curious ones. Eyes that don't sparkle with reverence, but narrow with suspicion. Welcome to the temple as surveillance state, where every act of pleasure echoed not only in heaven, but through the ever-vigilant corridors of human politics. At first, it's subtle. You notice it in the carvings. Eyes, always eyes, tucked in the background of otherwise sensual scenes. A lover mid-kiss while a shadowed figure peeks from behind a column. A priestess in trance while a stone monkey watches from the eaves. Even gods seem to spy on one another here. Vishnu smirks from a corner. Shiva peeks from behind his own third eye. These aren't just artistic flourishes. They're warnings. Every touch is recorded. Every whisper has a witness. The Khmer temples weren't just sacred theaters. They were arenas of control, of performance, of expectation. And not just from the divine. The mortal gaze mattered just as much. Especially when power, politics, and pleasure were so tightly interwoven. Imagine being a temple dancer, trained in sacred movements meant to arouse the divine, but knowing that behind every column, a monk might be judging your angle, a nobleman measuring your sway, a rival courtesan memorizing your footwork. Or imagine being a king, expected to perform a ritual of cosmic union each full moon while a court scribe recorded the timing, the chants, the sighs for posterity. His grace faltered during the 4th verse, the moon dimmed. That actually appears in one of the temple logs. Not as a metaphor, as a literal critique. Historians still argue whether these observers were sacred archivists or political spies. Some say their purpose was to ensure cosmic integrity, that rituals weren't being rushed or faked. Others suggest a more cynical reality. Temple surveillance was a way to control desire, to ensure that power flowed not from passion, but from obedience. The Khmer elite understood something very modern, that sex, once watched, becomes performance. And performance, once expected, becomes obligation. You suddenly recall that quote from Foucault again. Where there is power, there is resistance, but also surveillance. This temple didn't just sanctify sex, it disciplined it, trained it, packaged it for gods and for audiences. That's why corridors were built with narrow slits, not just for light, but for listening. That's why some murals include hidden figures, watching the main scene like ghostly voyeurs. Not all carvings told stories, some took notes. And here's the strangest part: many of those watching eyes were female. Senior courtesans, elder priestesses, queen mothers. Because while the men often performed the rituals, it was the women who evaluated them. The balance of pleasure and power was always under audit. One preserved record describes a high priestess halting a sacred union midway because the masculine principle did not match the breath of the moon. Translation? The king wasn't focused. His energy was off. She pulled the priestess aside, dismissed the king, and restructured the ritual for another night. That's divine HR in action. But this scrutiny wasn't limited to royalty. Even the lower ranks of temple servants were subject to erotic evaluation. Young acolytes were trained in stillness under touch, a kind of meditative resistance during massage, to test their discipline. Failures weren't punished, but noted. Patterns were watched. Favorites were recorded. And some, especially those who showed too much enthusiasm, were quietly reassigned to kitchen duty. You feel it now, don't you? That chill beneath thee. Jasmine heat? Because nothing kills freedom faster than the gaze that waits for you to falter. And when pleasure becomes a duty, and duty is always watched, desire morphs into strategy. You begin to move like a dancer with 1,000 mirrors. Never sure who's watching. Always half posing. One tale, half whispered and rarely discussed, tells of a temple scribe who fell in love with a priestess. Forbiddens, of course. He documented every ritual she performed, every chant, every scent she wore. He never touched her. But he watched. Always watched. And eventually, the priestess confronted him, not with anger, but exhaustion. She said, "You see everything I do, but not what I am. Stop recording, start remembering." He burned his scrolls that night, left the temple, became a forest hermit. They say he carved her name into every tree he slept beneath. Which brings us to the darkest irony of the temple's surveillance culture. In trying to capture divinity, they sometimes smothered it. In trying to measure holiness, they drained its spontaneity. Not always, but enough. One chamber you now enter shows this. Tension carved in stone. Two lovers, mid-embrace, surrounded by onlookers. Not angry, just observing. Faces blank, hands folded. One inscription reads, "The gods turned their backs, but the humans stayed to watch." You sit with that line. Let it crawl under your skin. Because it's a different kind of haunting, not supernatural, but social. The fear of being seen without being understood. Of being reduced to performance. The Khmer temple, in all its grandeur, carried this paradox like a weight. It exalted pleasure, yes, but also institutionalized it, regulated it, made it legible, documentable, survivable. And yet, somehow, it never lost the pulse. Because even under all that watching, love still happened. People still snuck away. Still kissed for no reason. Still touched not to perform, but to feel. One carving, tucked into a corner and almost missed, shows two hands meeting in secret beneath a curtain. No faces, no titles. Just fingers tangled like roots. And beneath it, one word. Enough. You don't know if it means this is enough or we've had enough. But either way, it lands. Because surveillance can't stop intimacy. Not real intimacy. It can only chase it underground. Into whispers, into hidden corridors, into carvings made for no one but the gods. Or perhaps just for us, centuries later, walking through this web of gazes, trying to remember how to move when no one is watching. You exhale, and the air tastes less like incense now. More like breath. Unstaged. Unscripted. You keep walking. Step into a new wing of the temple, and stop not because of silence, but because of noise. Not loud, not audible, but visual. A riot of movement explodes from the stone. Bodies again, of course, but this time something's different. The poses are sharper. The expressions more exaggerated. The gestures deliberate, stylized, dramatic. This isn't intimacy, this is declaration. And then you realize you've walked into a gallery of propaganda, erotic propaganda. Welcome to the realm where sensuality became strategy, where political power was carved in curves and thrones, were secured with thrusts. This is where the Khmer elite took their sacred duty and turned it into sacred branding. Every sculpture, every relief, every mural in this chamber is a flex. You scan one wall and see a king, unmistakably Jayavarman VII again, but not in battle or meditation. He's mid-embrace with a woman whose face glows like moonlight. Around them are celestial beings offering flowers, birds in flight, and lotus petals raining down. It's sensual, It's romantic. It's also entirely calculated. Because this scene, you realize, is propaganda carved in passion. A message etched in muscle and mythology. My union pleases the gods, therefore my rule is blessed. It's a political ad, Khmer style. No slogans, no speeches, just sacred sex as certification of cosmic authority. Historians still debate whether these depictions were accurate accounts of real rituals or aspirational fictions meant to solidify power. Some believe kings exaggerated their sacred unions to distract from political failures. Others argue that these erotic images were intentionally public, crafted to reassure the populace that the king's body was still aligned with divine order even if his treasury wasn't. It's a clever maneuver. In a world where droughts, wars, and invasions were regular guests at the door, the king needed to embody more than military might. He had to radiate harmony. And nothing says all is well like a god smiling down on a royal climax. 1. Scholar compared these carvings to medieval European coronation tapestries, where divine light beams down on the king as angels whisper Latin blessings. The Khmer just replaced Latin with lube. It's not cynical. It's savvy and deeply human. Because while sword and strategy built the kingdom, it was story that kept it from cracking. And the most powerful story? That pleasure is proof of order. That if the king could satisfy the goddess, he could surely feed the people. So yes, these carvings weren't just about gods and desire. They were about optics, PR carved into eternity. One panel shows a royal couple mid-union, but the king is staring directly out of the scene right at you. His eyes say, "Are you watching? Good. Remember this." Another shows a queen touching her husband's chest while a serpent curls protectively around them. At first glance, it's just sensual. But serpent imagery was linked to fertility and kingship. Her touch isn't affection. It's a royal endorsement. There's even a sequence, rare, partially broken, that shows a young prince being introduced to his future consort. Not through ceremony, but through ritualized physical contact. The final panel shows them embracing before a row of priests. Not in private, but on a raised platform. The title? He who pleases Devi, pleases the realm. You wonder how many of these rituals were documented to justify controversial marriages, or to solidify alliances. Imagine two rival houses uniting through marriage, then commissioning an erotic mural to prove that the gods approved. Not with a signature, with a shared moan. And it wasn't just the royals who used erotic imagery for power. Temples themselves commissioned murals of divine unions as a way to legitimize their space. One temple, funded by a minor noble family, includes a graphic mural of Indra blessing a king mid-union. The noble wasn't even a king, but the implication that he should be, or at least that the gods were considering it. Erotic art has resumed. But here's where it gets even murkier. Not all these carvings show pleasure. Some show restraint. One panel shows a king rejecting a consort's touch. His hand is raised, her eyes downcast. It's titled, "He Withholds to Restore Balance." Another shows a priestess kneeling in abstinence, her body covered, but her eyes fierce. "The moon waits," it reads. These are just as political as the others, because sometimes not touching is the most powerful image of all. It signals control, discipline, supernatural strength. In times of famine or war, when desire looked like decadence, kings needed to display chastity. And so the carvings changed, not erased, just rebranded. And in this way, eroticism in Khmer temples became not just sacred, not just social, but strategic. A way to reflect the mood of the realm, to reassure the faithful, to frighten enemies. "Look," the stone says, "we are still in control. Even our pleasure obeys the cosmos." One fringe theory even suggests that erotic murals doubled as surveillance passive warnings to temple staff and visitors that behavior was being noted. If we carved this, imagine what we remember. That might sound paranoid, but paranoia often has great taste in architecture. And if you think modern regimes are subtle with propaganda, remember that Angkor didn't use slogans, they used sculpted thighs. Now before you spiral into cynicism, consider this. Yes, this was manipulation, but it was also belief. The line between political myth and spiritual truth is thin, porous, and constantly rewritten. For the Khmer, the performance was the prayer, the image was the act. And in a world where gods lived in statues and rain waited on moon rituals, symbolism was survival. You walk slowly now through the rest of the gallery. The figures grow more theatrical. A woman standing on one leg, arms extended like wings. A man bent backward, holding a mirror as his partner kisses his throat. One figure in gold leaf, barely preserved, reaches into the stone itself, fingers vanishing into a carved portal. The title, He Enters the Unseen. And just like that, you feel it again. That shift, that reminder, that these carvings aren't only propaganda. They're also possibility. They show not just what was, but what could be, in union, in power, in presence. You turn a corner and see one last panel, two figures holding hands, eyes closed, no audience, no onlookers. The inscription, even uncarved love reshapes the stone. You pause, then you smile, and you keep walking. You turn the next corner and nearly collide with history's most awkward handshake, the one between colonial prudery and Khmer eroticism. Because here, carved cleanly through centuries of rain and silence, is a scar that doesn't quite heal. Welcome to the section where Victorian explorers walked in with pocket watches and monocles, looked at centuries of divine sex, and gasped like someone had flashed them in church. You step into a hall that feels abruptly muted, not by age, but by erasure. Carvings half chiseled, breasts flattened by stone tools, hips once flowing now squared off like someone took a ruler to the gods. This is what it looks like when repression arrives with a sketchbook and a sense of superiority. You can almost hear it, corsets tightening, mustaches bristling, pencils scratching feverishly as these 19th century French and British archaeologists attempted to document what they couldn't allow themselves to comprehend. They didn't just map Angkor, they censored it. They gave us some of the first full visual records of the site, yes, but they also edited those records with a surgeon's eye and a Puritan's shame. Reliefs that showed divine union, cropped, statues with visible genitalia, filed down, erotic murals, described in reports as degraded decorative motifs. And what they couldn't erase, they redefined. Sacred priestesses became temple prostitutes. Apsaras were labeled as dancing girls or nymphs. The rituals, branded as superstitious debauchery. Foucault would have called it a textbook case of Western knowledge production transforming foreign practices into pathology to preserve colonial control. You call it theft with a lace glove. The irony is absurd. Men who probably never saw their own wives unclothed were now the global authorities on a civilization that painted the cosmos in breasts and thighs. One French report from 1866 describes the apsaras as grotesquely sensual, a phrase that manages to be both judgmental and a little envious. Another British officer called the temple's erotic panels pagan and perverse, and then returned the next morning to study them alone for 6 hours. Let that sink in. What they saw as sign was actually the structure of Khmer cosmology. They missed the point entirely. Or maybe they didn't miss it, they just couldn't live with it. Because to admit that a society could be spiritually advanced and sexually expressive was to unravel the tight bundle of Victorian morality. So they rebranded, they cleaned, they categorized, they made it academic. They created museum exhibits where sacred items were displayed like exotic trophies. Phallic symbols were ritual fertility stones. Yoni basins were labeled agricultural water vessels. They used Latin to mask arousal, anthropology to dodge awe. You stand in front of a relief where the damage is obvious. Once, two figures danced in a tight spiral, their limbs interlocked in symmetrical devotion. Now only their torsos remain, heads scratched out, groins gouged. A plaque reads, "Weathering due to erosion." But a local guide once told a different story how early European restorers deemed the figures morally unsuitable and quietly removed them. The removed fragments? Still missing, possibly stolen, possibly buried, possibly displayed in a London or Paris cabinet, where no one dares ask what they really are. And yet, the temple resisted. You see it in the margins and the carvings tucked into corners, the smaller panels no one noticed in time. One shows two apsaras laughing together in a pool. Another, a priestess adjusting her partner's crown. These survived because they weren't grand, because the censors didn't look low. They were too busy reaching for the high friezes, trying to scrub shame from 10 feet up. But shame doesn't cling to stone, it evaporates. And here's where it gets even stranger. Some colonials weren't horrified. They were fascinated, privately of course. Publicly, they denounced, but privately, they were obsessed. One French officer reportedly kept sketches of his favorite erotic panels in a hidden folio titled "Studies in Divine Posture." Another supposedly commissioned a private carving in the style of Angkor, featuring himself with two apsaras. It now decorates a wine cellar in southern France. So while they rewrote the temples, they also stole them piece by piece, image by image, remaking them as fantasies for European salons. And the Khmer people? Silenced. Their interpretations sidelined, their oral histories dismissed. Western scholars debated the meaning of rituals while Cambodian elders were not even invited into the room. One elder told a researcher in the 1990s, "They came here, drew our gods, erased their hands, then sold the drawings." You wonder how many tourists walk through this temple today, unaware that what they see is curated damage. A narrative shaped by scissors. But then, in a glorious twist of cosmic revenge, the carvings begin to heal themselves. Not physically, of course, but symbolically. Cambodian scholars, artists, and spiritual leaders have begun reclaiming the narrative. They're rereading the murals, reviving the rituals, reasserting that these scenes were not exotic filth, but foundational texts of their ancestors. One modern priestess in training said, "When I dance the apsara, I don't think of beauty. I think of memory. My hips are remembering what the stone couldn't hold." And that's what you feel now, the stone remembering itself. Beneath the scars, the stories persist, not polished, not perfect, but breathing. You look again at a panel you thought was empty. At just the right angle, when the sun hits and your eyes adjust, a hidden figure emerges, a couple, barely visible, their arms entangled in a gesture not of lust, but of release. The inscription reads, "They hit us, but we remain." That, you think, is the temple's final laugh. Because no amount of prudery can erase devotion carved with this much conviction. No colonial nervousness can bleach out a culture that loved its gods so fiercely, it made pleasure part of prayer. You keep walking, past the scratched panels and censored gods, and you whisper to the stone, "I see you." And for just a moment, you think it whispers back. You step through a shadowed archway. The air is suddenly still, as if even the temple is holding its breath. And then you see it, not a room, but a ruin. Not a scene, but an ending. The stone here has cracked, not with age, with silence. You've walked through divine beds and sacred corridors, whispered with priestesses, winced under the colonial blade, but here, finally, is where the ritual stopped, where the moans gave way to dust. Welcome to the slow, tender collapse of the sacred bedroom. And no, it didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a fire, or an angry mob, or even a direct decree. It was something quieter, more insidious. A change. In breath, a kingdom's exhale that never turned into an inhale. You notice the carvings first. Once alive with rhythm and curve, now unfinished. Figures half-formed. Apsaras whose arms end mid-dance. Couples whose mouths never quite meet. The erotic grammar breaks down here. The poetry stumbles. The scenes dissolve into dust not because time is cruel, but because belief faltered. It started, they say, when the sacred kingship began to weaken. When Jayavarman's heirs, ambitious but brittle, saw rituals not as sacred duty but expensive theater. The union rites became rushed, the priestesses poorly trained. One report carved in a temple wall complains that the moon rites were late, the offerings spoiled, the incense unlit. That's not just a logistical error, that's cosmic neglect. And the gods in these stories don't punish with lightning. They punish with absence. The rain doesn't come, the crops wilt. The energy shifts. And when the divine stops answering, the bedroom door, the people begin to whisper. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe the king's breath isn't aligned. Maybe the temple's power is just story. And stories once doubted decay fast. Meanwhile, the outside world presses in. Traders arrive, speaking of distant empires with newer gods, colder philosophies, cleaner temples. Ideas shift. Buddhism, already intertwined with Khmer belief, begins to take a harder shape, less tantric, more ascetic. Suddenly, pleasure becomes suspect. Sensuality becomes sign. The once venerated courtesans are rebranded as distractions. The priestesses fade into the margins. The ritual rooms are sealed for maintenance and quietly never reopened. 1. Account from a visiting monk describes the temple as full of ghosts and stone and too much perfume. That wasn't a compliment. And with each new wave of moral reform, the sacred union becomes a relic. The apsaras become just pretty girls. The lingam becomes symbolic. The rites are demoted to rumor. Within a century, the once sacred bedroom is just another dark corridor in a fading temple complex. The stone stops being touched. The oils stop being warmed. The breath, the one you felt humming under every carving, starts to fade. And the temple begins to forget itself. You step deeper now into a chamber that's clearly been repurposed. The carvings are awkwardly plastered over. A Buddha statue sits where once a ritual bed stood. It's beautiful, yes, but jarringly out of place. You can feel the tension in the stone, like it's holding in a scream it's not allowed to voice. That's what happens when belief shifts too fast. The old gods don't vanish, they sulk. And yet some traces remain. You run your hand along the side wall and feel it, faint but undeniable. A carving of two hands, barely touching, hidden behind the plaster. Someone didn't erase it. Someone hid it. Because not everyone wanted the sacred intimacy to die. Even as the rituals ended, some temple caretakers tried to keep the pulse alive. They sang the old mantras under their breath. They cleaned the stone with leftover oils. They whispered the names of forgotten goddesses into the cracks. They didn't resist the new religion. They just remembered the old one. One fringe story told only in certain rural villages claims that a final priestess, too old to dance but too sacred to dismiss, performed one last union ritual during a lunar eclipse. Not for a king, not even for the gods. For the temple itself. They say she lay down on the cold stone, chanted the mantras, anointed the altar with her own breath. And when the eclipse ended, she was gone. No body, no clothes. Just a circle of warm petals where her heart had been. You don't have to believe it. The temple does, and that's enough. But this wasn't just a spiritual decline. It was also political. The sacred bedroom was a site of power, and when the kingship fragmented, when invaders came, when regional lords fought like jackals over royal remains, the last thing anyone wanted was a symbol of unity, so they let it rot, not burned. Just neglected, ignored into oblivion. It's worse somehow. Death by indifference. You stand in the middle of the ruined sanctum and feel that grief, not personal, but architectural. This place mourns, not with sobs, with silence. You start to hear the ghosts differently now, not as eerie whispers, as sighs, as breath that was once shared, once sacred, now echoing into rooms that no longer remember what it meant. And yet, even in this slow decay, there's defiance. A carved lotus still blooming on the ceiling. A yoni basin that still holds rainwater. A broken sculpture of a priestess with half a smile still carved into her face, as if she knew that nothing truly sacred is ever erased. Just repurposed, waiting. That's the thing about temples. They don't die, they hibernate. They outlive ideologies, tourists, invasions, textbooks. They hold onto the pulse, quietly, stubbornly, until someone like you comes along and listens. Again, you exhale. Not a dramatic breath, just an honest one. The kind the old priestesses might have used before lighting incense. And for a second, the room feels less dead. The stone less cold, not reborn, but remembered. And maybe that's the secret, that sacredness isn't a performance or a system, it's memory. Alive in hands and hips in old rituals half recalled. At sunset, a woman washing her hair with jasmine because her grandmother once did. A man lighting a candle in silence because something about the shape of the flame feels familiar. You turn to leave the chamber, and on the lintel, barely visible, scratched into the stone not by artisan but by hand, is a line of untrained script. The gods slept here. We did not forget. You nod softly and keep walking. You step into a brighter corridor where the dust feels looser, almost playful, like the past is teasing you instead of haunting you. And it hits you. You're no longer alone. Not in the metaphysical sense. In the literal, fanny pack wearing, selfie stick wielding sense. You've crossed into the modern world's version of sacred space, the tourist zone. This is where today's Cambodia tries to reconcile Angkor's erotic soul with its Instagram persona, and where the sacred sex once carved in stone is now trapped between myth and misread. You look around. A man in cargo shorts snaps a photo of an apsaras cleavage, then checks his phone without looking twice. A young influencer in gauzy white poses beneath a lintel once used in lunar fertility rites. Her caption already forming in her head. Spiritual vibes. #sacred energy. A guide waves a laminated pamphlet and rattles off facts about dynasties in sandstone, skipping right over the Yoni Lingam altar beside him as if it were just a decorative flower pot. You almost want to laugh. Almost. Because this isn't malice. It's marketing. And the temple has been commodified into something between a postcard and a scavenger hunt. Modern myths swirl like mosquitoes around every tour group. You hear one guide whispering to a couple, "That statue? That's where the king had his 100 concubines. He'd pick one every night." Another claims the apsaras were basically dancers like Cambodian geishas. You wince, not because they're wrong, but because they're close enough to sound true and far enough to be dangerous. This is how history becomes kitsch. How sacred stories get flattened into fun facts. How the complexity of ritual sex becomes a whispered joke in hostile common rooms. It's not even the eroticism that bothers modern tourism, it's the spirituality behind it. Sex? Sure, that sells. But sex as theology? That's harder to package. Easier to giggle and move on. So the sacred union becomes Khmer Kama Sutra. The priestess becomes the hot one with the hips. And the temple's metaphysical blueprint becomes background for wedding shoots. Historians still argue whether this commodification is harmless cultural evolution or a form of erasure. Some say modern engagement keeps the site alive. Others argue that in sanding off the rough edges of the past, we lose the heartbeat altogether. But you're standing between both camps now. Watching a child chew gum beside a lingam altar. Watching an elderly woman light incense in silence nearby, her eyes closed, lips moving in a private chant. This temple is being pulled in two directions, one toward spectacle, the other toward survival, and sometimes they overlap. One local guide, tired of the same tourist questions, started inventing her own erotic myths. She tells couples that apsaras only appear to those who kiss beneath the east gate, that if you touch the yoni basin at dusk, you'll dream of your past lover. None of it's true, but it's not a lie either. She calls it protective fiction. She's trying to keep the temple mysterious to make people pause, to make them feel, because the real tragedy of tourism isn't the misreading. It's the forgetting. It's when the guests move through the temple like it's a zoo for dead gods. When they forget that people once breathed here with purpose. That every erotic carving wasn't scandal, it was scripture. One carving, you notice, has been touched so many times it gleams like polished bone. It's just an apsara mid-dance. But something about her hips makes people reach out without thinking. You see it all day. 100 hands grazing the same curve. The body remembers what the mind forgets. You meet a group of college students on a heritage trip. They've been given a sanitized version of the temple's history, dates, dynasties, droughts. You ask if they've learned about the sacred sex rites. Blank stares, one laughs. You mean the temple orgies? You nod. Sort of. They think it's a joke. You think it's a funeral. And yet, not all is lost. At the temple's edge, tucked behind the gift stalls and soda vendors, you find a tiny altar new, brightly painted, simple. A young couple kneels there. They're not tourists, locals, maybe newlyweds. The woman places a jasmine garland on the offering plate. The man lights a stick of incense, then leans in and says something softly. She smiles. It's not performative. Not even obviously religious. It's just tender. You ask later what the altar's for. A nearby caretaker shrugs. That's where people ask the gods to bless their love. Not marriage, not fertility. Love. You feel it then. That thread still alive, even if frayed. That somewhere beneath the hashtags and tour groups, the sacred intimacy still whispers. Not loudly, but enough. And it's not just locals doing the remembering. Some modern artists and scholars have started reclaiming Angkor's erotic past. You find a gallery exhibit in Siem Reap where young Cambodian painters reinterpret temple scenes, except this time, the priestesses are drawn as fierce, fully autonomous figures. The kings look unsure, the gods look amused. One painting shows a lingam overgrown with jungle vines. The caption reads, "Nature always remembers the shape of desire." There are also dance collectives restaging apsara movements, not for tourists, but for healing. Workshops where breathwork meets history. Even TikTok videos where users explain the tantric roots of temple architecture in 30 seconds, complete with flute music and slow zooms. It's uneven, imperfect, but it's something. You walk past a new tour group now, and the guide, a young man in his 20s, says, "And this is where the king would meet the priestess to perform a ritual of sacred union." A tourist snickers. "You mean sex?" The guide smiles but doesn't flinch. "I mean alignment of body, breath, and cosmos." And just like that, the story breathes again. You stand quietly at the edge of the crowd, looking back at the temple. The tourists come and go. The cameras flash. The sacred remains. Maybe not untouched, but not forgotten. Just waiting. You keep walking. You almost miss it. Hidden behind a curtain of banyan roots, half buried by time and indifference, is a door. Not a grand gate or ceremonial arch, just a narrow wooden frame, leaning like it's tired from centuries of being ignored. You duck inside, and everything changes. The air thickens, but not with humidity, with memory. Not stories carved in stone, but breath held in the cracks. Because here, in this final chamber, Cambodia's quiet recall begins not as a revival, not as a reenactment, but as something softer. A murmur, a nudge, a pulse You're standing in what looks like a forgotten prayer room. But it's not. Forgotten, it's repurposed. A fresh clay pot sits in one corner, still wet. A bundle of jasmine wilts on a low altar. And in the dust you notice footprints, not from tourists, but bare, local, recent. The kind of prints that come from people who walk with purpose, who come not to look, but to listen. This is where the sacred returns. Not with trumpets or festivals, with simplicity. Locals call this space the still room. It's not on any map. Not marked with signage. But people find it. Lovers, widows, young girls with questions, old men with regrets. They come here to sit, to remember, and some say to be remembered. Because belief never dies. It hides, it whispers. And eventually, if you're quiet enough, it finds a way back in. One caretaker you meet later says this used to be a preparation chamber for priestesses, where they meditated before union rituals. Not to cleanse, she says, to awaken. This is where they came to feel. You sit down. The floor is warm, not sun-warmed. Body warmed. You don't know when the last ritual was performed here. But the room knows. The stone remembers the rhythm. And someone recently has left a carved offering. It's small, barely visible in the corner. A lingam and yoni, shaped not from stone but from clay. Rough, uneven, clearly made by hand. And beside it, a folded piece of cloth. Crimson, silk, possibly a sash. Possibly a memory. You ask the caretaker who left it. She just smiles. We don't ask. They come. They leave what they feel. It's not a tourist exhibit. It's a practice. Quiet, subtle, sacred. And it's not the only one. Across Cambodia, scattered like seeds in the wind, there's a slow return of reverence for what the temples once meant, not as monuments, but as manuals. Younger generations, raised on textbooks and tuk-tuk tours, are asking deeper questions. They're not trying to recreate the rituals exactly, but they want to know, what did it feel like to believe that pleasure aligned the stars? That a dance could summon rain? That your body was a map of the divine? You meet a 23-year-old dancer in Phnom Penh, who's choreographing new apsara movements. She says the old ones feel stiff, posed for cameras. I want to move like the river again. Like the priestesses did when they weren't being filmed. Her troupe performs barefoot, at dusk, in front of shrines, not for applause, but for energy. It's not performance, she says. It's participation, and she's not alone. There are healers offering oil rituals based on temple era. Formulas, couples marrying in quiet ceremonies modeled on the binding of light. Artists sketching modern-day priestesses into the margins of Khmer folklore. None of it is state-sanctioned. None of it is advertised. But it spreads. Like jasmine at midnight, slowly, persistently, sensually. You visit a local school where a teacher introduces students to temple iconography. But instead of just naming gods and dates, she asks them, what do you think they were feeling? One boy points at a carving of Shiva and Parvati entwined. Maybe they're scared, because loving someone that much is scary. Another says they're calm, like they already know the ending. These are not academic answers, they're sacred ones. From a generation trying not to rebuild what was lost, but to feel what was forgotten. And the elders? Many still hold the stories. They just stopped telling them when no one asked. But when you do, when you really ask, they unfold like scrolls kept in the chest. One grandmother describes how her mother used to trace apsara patterns on her back with her finger to help her fall asleep. She said the gods lived in our spines, she laughs. I never forgot that. Another woman shares a family ritual of lighting a candle on her wedding night and whispering a mantra as she untied her hair. Not for my husband, she says. For me, to let the goddess enter. It's not always glamorous. Some stories are fractured, others unsure. But together, they form something rare, a cultural heartbeat coming back to life, not in stone, but in skin. You return to the still room one more time before leaving, and you find something new. A small bowl of coconut water, a flower floating in it, and a piece of charcoal on the floor used to write a phrase on the wall. 4 words written by an uncertain hand. The body is prayer. No attribution, no flourish, just truth. You sit for a long time, not meditating, just being. Just letting the temple remember through you. The breath slows. The noise fades. And you feel it, that same rhythm the priestesses felt. The one the carvings try to freeze. The one that has never stopped pulsing beneath this place. The sacred isn't gone. It just changed address. Moved from thrones to gardens, from altars to kitchens, from royal beds to the spaces between breaths. You stand lighter. Not because the weight has lifted, because it's been shared. And as you walk out of this still room, the caretaker says one last thing. We don't need to bring the temple back. We just have to stop pretending it ever left. You nod and keep walking. You reach the outer threshold of the temple complex, where the jungle starts to reclaim what the centuries tried to forget. And for a moment, the world outside feels louder, rougher, too bright. But you don't leave yet. Because there's one more breath, one final pulse left in this story. You sit beneath a banyan tree whose roots twist like limbs mid-dance, and you look back not at the grandeur of towers or the symmetry of steps, but at the story that's now curled inside you. Not learned, exactly. Reawakened. The Khmer temples didn't just worship sex. They wove it into the DNA of reality. They treated pleasure not as indulgence, but as architecture. Desire as alignment. Union as ritual. Every stone you walked past tonight bore witness to a culture that believed your body was not a distraction from enlightenment, but its vessel, its map, its temple. This wasn't romanticism. It was cosmology. Here, sex wasn't hidden behind curtains or shamed into silence. It was choreographed, sanctified, observed, even legislated, but never erased. Until, of course, it was. You remember the scoured walls, the shaved breasts, the propaganda of shame disguised as preservation. You remember the silence that followed, the centuries of tourists snapping photos with no idea of the rights they stood on. And then, slowly, the return, the whispers, the unspoken offerings, the jasmine laid quietly by young hands. A culture, beginning to hum again, not with nostalgia, but with recognition. Not trying to resurrect the past as it was, but to listen to the parts of it that still pulse, that still matter. Because here's what no guidebook says. Sacredness is not in the stone, it's in the attention. The way someone steps carefully over a threshold. The way a hand hovers over a carving, not to touch but to feel. The way someone remembers to ask, what did this mean? Instead of, what does it look like? You think of the priestess who once danced so wildly, she burst into flame. Of the boy who said loving someone that much must be scary. Of the grandmother tracing apsara swirls down her child's back. These aren't fragments. They're footnotes to a living document. The temple isn't dead. It's in distribution. In the way a woman touches her hair. The way two lovers exhale in sync. The way you feel right now under this tree, less like a visitor, more like a witness. And maybe that's what the gods were waiting for all along. Not for rituals to return perfectly, but for reverence to return honestly. Because maybe the most sacred thing is not the carved act, but the acknowledgement of it. That once, humans dared to believe that love, desire, and divinity could exist in the same breath, and that we still can. As you prepare to leave, you glance back one last time. The stone doesn't speak, but it doesn't have to. You carry its voice now, in your walk, in your wondering, in your refusal to reduce the erotic to the vulgar, the spiritual to the sterile. And as the breeze catches the edge of your shirt, and the smell of rain hints at the horizon. You smile not because you've reached the end, but because this story never really ends. It loops, it lingers, like a chant half heard in a dream. Like the scent of oil on skin you didn't know you still remembered. You take one step forward, and the temple takes one with you. You're still here. That's the miracle. After temples, whispers, priestesses, and centuries of remembering, you're still breathing, slowly now, as if your lungs learned something tonight. You don't need to move. Not yet. Let the stillness settle. Let your body feel heavy in the best possible way, like it's made of stories instead of bones. The jungle outside the temple hums with night creatures, and the air carries a hush that isn't silence, just ancient music slowed down. You've walked through chambers where desire was sacred, where gods took form in pleasure, where stone remembered what people forgot. And now, in the quiet dark of your own room, maybe your breath has joined that long rhythm, the same one the priestesses once matched with their feet, the same one that curled in incense and jasmine and mantra. There's no quiz, no final exam, just memory. Just a soft return to something deeper, older, wider than words. You close your eyes and picture the carvings, the ones that weren't posed, but pulsed. Not performance, but invitation. Not spectacle, but stillness. It's okay to forget the details. Let them blur. Let them wash into dream. Just carry one thing with you, maybe two. That sacred doesn't mean sanitized. That the body can be a temple when it listens, when it aligns, when it remembers. It belongs to something more than function or fear. You did that tonight, without incense, without stone. Just by listening, just by being here. So let your breath slow even more now. Let your jaw soften, your hands still. The story will stay with you, even if you sleep. Especially if you sleep. Because that's where temples love to whisper. In the moments right before dreams begin. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.